Trump's big, beautiful tax bill, it could go up for a vote as soon as tonight, and you've got the president himself claiming that the GOP is tremendously unified. But this notably as key members of the party have said the exact opposite. Right, so the top level TLDR is that this measure, which was drafted by House Republicans, it would set key parts of Trump's legislative agenda, with the bulk of the initial legislation being composed of more than $4 trillion in tax cuts, which include the extension of the 2017 cuts made under the first Trump administration. But also, in order to pay for that, the GOP has proposed a series of cost-cutting measures. With that, including among other things, massive cuts to food stamps and Medicaid that will force millions of poor Americans to lose their health insurance and other key benefits. But even then, a preliminary analysis by the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimated that this proposal would add roughly $2.3 trillion to the debt over the next decade, which, sirens going off, is a figure that many economists and Wall Street investors find incredibly alarming. And it's one that would force officials to mandate across-the-board spending cuts, including slashing Medicare by nearly $500 billion over 10 years. Right, and that, as the CBO also found, that the Republicans' big, beautiful bill would hurt the poorest Americans as it benefits the richest, with them estimating that in 2027, the bottom 10% would lose the equivalent of 2% of their income, largely thanks to reduced benefits. And while that's happening, the top 10% is projected to see an increase of 4% thanks to the Trump tax cuts. So needless to say, Democrats have wholeheartedly opposed this legislation, which has left the Republicans scrambling to cobble together enough of their slim majority to try and get this passed. And, scramble they have, though it has been an absolute nightmare for them to try to get this divided party to hash out the final details. On one side, you have hardline conservatives urging deeper cuts to offset the trillions of dollars of tax cuts, and they're specifically pushing to slash Medicaid and other federal benefit programs even more. But then also, more moderate members and representatives from blue states or swing districts, they've rejected further cuts to programs that their constituents rely on. Right, and then another major sticking point for that group is further increasing the cap on the state and local tax deduction, which is also known as SALT, and it allows taxpayers to write off the amount that they paid in local taxes when they file federal taxes. But many conservative hawks have been skeptical or outright opposed any additional increases to the cap, with the initial legislation already bumping it from $10,000 to $30,000. And so with all that, you then had Trump going to the House to throw his weight around, try to persuade members of his party to rally behind the bill, and seemingly at times even threatening them. With, for example, when asked if lawmakers who oppose the bill would face primary challenges, Trump responded, possibly, and later added, they wouldn't be a Republican much longer. They would be knocked out so fast. Trump then also went on to single out Representative Thomas Massie, who's a libertarian who has been outspoken about his opposition to the bill's spending levels, and the president telling reporters he doesn't understand government. He should be voted out of office. But then more generally speaking, Trump played to the middle of his caucus, with him reportedly telling hawkish members not to fuck around with Medicaid benefits, while also instructing moderates to just accept the SALT deduction cap as is. And ultimately, Trump emerging from the meeting expressing confidence that his party will pass the tax bill and declaring that the GOP is tremendously unified. But in reality, and understand things can change, currently that does not appear to be the case, with it also unclear how much of an impact Trump actually had in swaying members. Or with, for example, the Washington Post reporting that despite Trump's visits, the GOP's narrow majority remained far from unified around the proposal. And even after the meeting, things were still so tenuous that the House Rules Committee, which needs to pass the measure first before it can go to a full floor vote, it had to hold a rare overnight meeting to hash out the final details, with members convening at 1 o'clock in the morning and debating well into the morning. And as the Rules Committee debated, Speaker Johnson and other GOP leaders worked behind the scenes to negotiate with the remaining holdouts, with Johnson reportedly promising the Rules Committee at the beginning of their overnight meeting that he would get them a new version of the bill built on his ongoing negotiation. But then, according to reports from the New York Times, after 8 hours of debate, Johnson had failed to deliver any modifications. Though, with that said, the Speaker did announce that he did indeed reach a deal with the moderate Republican holdouts who wanted an increase on the SALT deduction cap, with Johnson confirming that he had agreed to raise the cap to $40,000 beginning in 2025 for taxpayers earning less than $500,000. And this morning, while speaking about the agreement, he expressed very high optimism that the bill would pass, telling reporters, "We plan to do it tonight if possible." But that, as you also had the more hawkish Republicans disputing that. For example, Representative Andy Harris, the chair of the ultra-conservative House Freedom Caucus, telling Newsmax, "I think, actually, we're further away from a deal because the SALT cap increase upset a lot of conservatives," saying, "We actually stopped negotiating before midnight because we actually had a deal that was then pulled off the table. So again, this bill actually got worse overnight," with him then explicitly adding, "There is no way it passes today." But then notably here, he appeared to walk back those statements at least a little bit after a private meeting with Johnson, with him saying that the fiscal hardliners in the party saw a pathway forward and were greatly encouraged by the progress that's been made in the last 24 hours. But then he also reiterated that he still doesn't think that the legislation can be passed today or even this week. And to that point, you also had another conservative leader indicating that the bill may not get passed by the Memorial Day deadline that Johnson has set, calling it a completely arbitrary deadline and arguing that it is more important to get this right, to get it correct, than to get it fast. Though that said, there is sort of a deadline, right? A big element of this bill is that it also raises the debt ceiling, which sets the amount of money that the government can borrow to pay its bills bills. And you've got the Treasury Secretary saying that lawmakers have until mid-July to increase the debt limit or risk a disastrous default. But regardless, what we're hearing from key Republicans on the ground here seems to fly in the face of everything that Johnson and Trump have said. And so for now, we're gonna have to wait to see how this plays out, if they can get this bill on the floor, what changes, who changes. But then even if that does eventually happen, the measure still faces weeks of debate in the Senate where changes are expected. And while Republicans are trying to pass this bill using the reconciliation process, which allows them to bypass the filibuster, the complicated rules that come with that process could still threaten its chances of success. So I'll also say, notably here on the topic of the Senate, we saw that chamber unexpectedly pass the No Tax on Tips Act, which is exactly what it sounds like, a bill that would eliminate the federal income tax for tips. And specifically, the legislation, which was introduced by Ted Cruz and a bipartisan group of senators, it would create a federal income tax deduction of up to $25,000 a year for tips given in cash, credit and debit card, and checks. Right, so eligible employees would be able to claim a 100% deduction in their tax filings of up to $25,000 in earned tips each year. Though notably, there is a cap for employees who made more than $160,000 in the last tax year, which is a limit that increases with inflation. Right, but the fact that this measure passed the Senate, it was surprising for a few reasons. First of all, it just generally feels like a miracle anytime any legislation can pass with bipartisan support. Right, and while the idea of no tax on tips has garnered widespread support from across the political spectrum, it's really something that was popularized by Trump, who made it a key promise during his campaign. And in fact, part of the reason that we're talking about this now is because Trump's big, beautiful bill also includes a provision that would pause taxes on tipped wages and overtime pay. But Democrats who are against the so-called big, beautiful bill, they've argued that this specific effort would be doomed if it stays in the tax package. Also, it presents them the opportunity to show they support this particular idea, but they can still be against the other bill. Which then brings us to the second reason this vote was a surprise, right? Which was the way that the No Tax on Tips Act was passed. It was very unusual. Because you see, Democratic Senator Jackie Rosen, who co-sponsored the bill, brought it up for approval through a process called unanimous consent, which allows any lawmaker to go to the Senate floor and seek passage of legislation as long as no other member objects. Though normally, unanimous consent is used for more routine and procedural matters, with, for example, Politico explaining that unanimous consent success rates are not high for major changes to the tax code. Now also, what I'll add here is while you have many applauding this move, you also have many experts saying that this proposal, it won't actually do much to help working Americans. And that is, some projections show that it'll cost the federal government between $10 to $15 billion in lost revenue every year. Because according to an analysis by Yale's Budget Lab, tipped workers do not make up a large share of the labor force, with them adding that those who do tend to be much younger than non-tipped workers and do not make enough to pay federal income tax anyway. In fact, some economists say this move could actually hurt low-income tipped workers. Right, in that because it would increase their total income enough to make them ineligible for other more significant tax benefits. And some progressive groups further warning that this plan could just distract from other policies that could more successfully benefit working class and low-income Americans. But as far as what's going to happen next, right, the No Tax on Tips Act, it still needs to get passed by the House and signed by Trump. And then even with that, you had Senator Cruz indicating that the measure could be passed as part of the broader tax bill. And because a version of it's already included in that legislation, it seems like House leaders would probably opt to keep it there rather than have a whole separate vote. But also, that decision ultimately depends on the fate of the big, beautiful bill, which brings us kind of full circle to where we started.